Pleasure to welcome Lord Hannay, David Hannay, Lord Hannay of Chiswick, who served as our ambassador in Brussels to the European Union and subsequently also in New York to the United Nations, one of our most senior and most experienced diplomats, who is now chairing the Senior European Experts Group, which I think it's fair to say is much in demand for its wisdom and its insights. Lord Hannay's very kindly come up from London today. He's no stranger to Oxford by any means, and he may well be known to some of us here. He has his own analysis of how he believes Brexit after Brexit will unfold, and we're very eager to hear him. He's very kindly agreed that his address will be on the record. It's being recorded, and he's very happy, he tells me, to take questions. So, Lord Hannay, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Graham, and thank you for asking me along to this event. It's quite nostalgic in a way, because although you may think that my only occasions on which I passed the Porter's Lodge at Somerville would have been in search of one of its totally female inhabitants, but that is not actually the case, because my tutor for my special subject, which was the diplomacy leading up to the First World War, when I was reading history at Oxford, was actually a Don at Somerville, a lady called Agatha Ram, who was always said to have never looked at any man since she once saw Mr. Gladstone. And she wrote his, I think his diaries. She published his diaries. She was a very distinguished lady, and she put up with me for a year doing my special subject. So it was a nostalgic moment to come through the door here again. And I chose this title, which is perhaps a bit trite, Brexit after Brexit, partly because of the efforts of the Prime Minister and others to say that the word Brexit was never to be mentioned again. Well, I'm afraid he's not going to be successful in that hope. But not only for that reason, but because there is an enormous amount of Brexit out there in front of us, as well as quite a lot of it behind us. And of course, when you first asked me to come and address your AGM, or to talk after your AGM, to be more exact, it was a very different situation and context to the one we're in now, because I was meant to be coming here on the 13th of November, which was, of course, in the middle of, by then, or the beginning of an election campaign. And I would have been speaking against a completely different background. Then we were still in the European Union, and it was possible to hope, indeed I hoped sincerely, that we could remain so. And it was possible, as many of us were doing, to campaign for the withdrawal deal and the political declaration, which had been on the future of the UK-EU relationship, which had been struck late in October by Boris Johnson's government, to get that put to the electorate in a referendum for a final decision one way or another. That hope, alas, died on the election day in December. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on why that happened in the way it happened, but just to say that a number of, quite a few, pretty egregious errors were made, among which I would certainly include trying to revoke Article 50 without holding a referendum, and I would also include triggering an election ahead of such a referendum. And the fact, thirdly, that in our quasi-presidential election system, no opposition leader who presented themselves in the election had much appeal to the electorate, and that did not help, to put it mildly. But I don't want to rake over the ashes of those events this evening. Now we have left the European Union, and we all of us have to come to terms with the realities of Brexit. And we face, at the very least, 10 months of arduous and, I fear, probably quite confrontational negotiation over the UK's future relationship with the EU 27. I doubt if it makes much sense to stand here in front of you and to speculate now whether that 10-month period is going to prove sufficient, whether it has any real credibility, and whether it's likely to be achieved in fact. We'll know the answer to that soon enough. But there are, just to try to set it out, roughly 3 possible broad outcomes. One is that a deal will be struck and ratified before the end of the year, before the end of 2020. Second possibility, we go over a cliff into a no-deal situation and World Trade Organization trade terms, now called the Australian option, despite the fact that the Australians themselves find this status so unattractive that they're actually negotiating a free trade area deal with the EU as we speak. And that could happen at the beginning of 2021. Or thirdly, the transitional period will be extended, either wholly or in part, to allow time for further negotiation. And I regard that possibility, I do not think that it can be completely excluded or discounted, however many times the Prime Minister says that it should be. What will be the pinch points in that negotiation that we are going to be involved in for this year of transition? Transition, not really, certainly not the implementation phase of Theresa May's Orwellian language would have it, but effectively a standstill. Brexit in name only, if you could call it that, except that we will no longer have any say over the decisions applying to us. Well, here are some broad themes, and I'll talk to one or two of the specifics. The issue of sequencing in this negotiation will be pretty important, as it was in the negotiations between 2017 and 2019. Theresa May got that comprehensively wrong, conceding from the outset the EU's preferred sequencing, concentrating on the divorce settlement and consigning the future relationship to a vague and non-binding political declaration. Judging from the text of the Commission's draft mandate and our own government's statement to Parliament made 10 days ago, it appears as if repeating that mistake, a sequencing which was really against our interest, will be avoided, and that the idea, which still lurks around, that absolute priority should be given to the negotiations on trade in goods, to the exclusion of everything else, trade in services, recognition of professional qualifications, data processing, cooperation on research and innovation, internal security, the fight against international crime, foreign and defence policy cooperation. Those are all the things that would not be covered by an agreement on trade in goods. That sequencing may be avoided this time, because both sides have setting out, the Commission in its draft mandate, setting out a much more comprehensive approach that covers all these things I've mentioned, and the British government's statement to Parliament does roughly the same. But watch out, As the months wind by, siren voices will be heard saying that all we really need is a bare bones trade in goods agreement. They will need to be resisted. Going over a cliff edge on all the rest, 80% of our economy to the EU, of course, is in services. And unlike the trade in goods, we actually export a lot more than we import. And that would be a hugely damaging situation if we just did the bare bones trade in goods deal. Second thematic issue. We can certainly expect the government, as the autumn approaches, to trot out that mantra of which we are all too familiar, that no deal is better than a bad deal, in the hope that this will put the wind up our negotiating partners. Well, it didn't do so in 2017, it didn't do so in 2018, it didn't do so in 2019. So I can't see any reason to believe, and I see no indication, that it will do so in 2020. Nor will wishful thinking about splits in the EU 27 coming to our rescue be that likely to materialise. I doubt if it'll happen to any serious extent. That's quite different from saying that there'll be quite a bit of bargaining in the process by which the mandate is adopted and the negotiations are carried on. But in any case, if you just stop for 5 minutes to think about it, why should it be in our interest that the 27 be divided? Because we can't have a deal with the 27 if they're not united, because they have to be united to have a deal. So sowing confusion and disagreement amongst them may seem to be a frightfully clever, what Baldrick would have called a cunning plan, but it's not, I'm afraid, likely to produce frightfully good results, because we do actually need them to reach an agreement with us. And then third, and you will hear an enormous amount about this, the level playing field, to which both parties signed up in the political declaration, but from which our government is now seeming to wish to diverge as an issue of principle. And we heard in the lecture that David Frost gave earlier this week all that set out in what I'm afraid to say I would class as beta double minus history and beta treble minus economics. But that said, it hardly seems wise to raise this issue of the level playing field and divergence as a fundamental issue of principle, since the government quite clearly has not actually got any clear idea of where it wants to diverge and by how much it wants to diverge. It just says it wants the principle of divergence to be conceded. They haven't said which sectors it would apply to. Would it apply to cars? Would it apply to chemicals? Would it apply to data? Well, I don't actually think it's terribly likely to apply to any of those, because an awful lot of the cars go to the rest of Europe and they will need to conform to the standards there. The REACH chemical regulation is absolutely crucial to the whole chemical industry of Europe, including Britain. And data processing, the idea of having different data processing regions, is pretty nightmarish, although some people say that we could get advantage from it. I haven't seen that argued very convincingly. So it's not all that likely that there will be many. There could be some where we will have a legitimate reason to diverge. There could even be some where, after negotiation, it could be agreed that this is not fundamental to the agreement we're reaching with the European Union. But you're not going to get there by saying that you want, as an issue of principle, to have the right to diverge whenever you like, and by however much you like. So insisting on divergence in any case as a principle does have an extremely heavy upfront cost, because we're going to pay for that in terms of the sort of free trade area agreement we get, before we've even decided where it is we want to diverge. And we'll have paid the cost before we work out where we want to diverge. So I should just add, because there's a lot of nonsense being talked about this at the moment, that the concept of a level playing field commitment on things like state aids, environmental standards, and many other regulatory aspects is not just some idea dreamed up by mad federalists in Brussels. It is actually, if you look at it carefully, you will find that, for example, the recently renegotiated Canada-Mexico-United States Free Trade Agreement contains a great deal of level playing field provisions. Put in there by who? Put in there by Donald Trump, the great upholder of national sovereignty. He is the person who has insisted that the Mexicans conform to certain labor standards if they are to remain in a free trade arrangement with the United States. And you'll see the same thing if you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has now got an acronym so long I can't remember it, but in any case, it has a lot of level playing field provisions in it too. So there will be no ducking the level playing field as an issue in these negotiations. And starting out with such an across-the-board confrontational approach to it, as we are doing now, and the Commission is doing in response, is certainly not going to make it any easier to find common ground. One pinch point, which I'm afraid will be pretty pervasive too, as well as the level playing field, is, and it's already apparent that that will be so, is fish. Not because of the economic significance of fish and trade in fish products, because that's a relatively small part of our economy and the economy of the rest of Europe, but because of its sensitivity to fishing communities on both sides of the English and Irish channels and the North Sea, and also because of its totemic significance in the Leave campaign, which held out a lot of extraordinarily unwise and unrealistic promises. Any deal on fisheries to be struck will need to contain, I would suggest, 3 elements. First, the shared management of fish stocks between the UK and the EU, which will have to recognise the inconvenient fact that fish do not notice when they're swimming across national boundaries or when they're in and out of somebody's exclusive economic zone. And we do need to have shared management because in the past, we collectively, the EU's common fisheries policy, inflicted very close to irreparable damage on a number of stocks from overfishing, and that must not happen again. The second element of any deal on fisheries, and the one that's far the most sensitive, will be the access for vessels from each side to the territorial waters and exclusive economic zones of the other. And of course, there are a lot more fish to be caught in our territorial waters between 6 and 12 miles and the EEZ that is ours once we, as a result of leaving, than there will be in their EEZ, to which we would have some access if there was a mutual agreement. But it will have to be a part of any deal. And third, there is the whole issue of tariff treatment in the EU market, to which a steadily increasing proportion of the catches we've been making, and that's particularly true of things like shellfish, salmon, and other high-value products, to which they've been going in an increasing degree in recent years. The figures are pretty impressive, and since you kindly mentioned the Senior European Experts Group, if you wait for about a week, you'll get a paper on the fisheries policy, which will tell you more than you want to hear tonight, I suspect. But Now, of those three elements on fish, the second one, access to waters, will be far the most difficult. But just remember that long before the Common Fisheries Policy even existed, because it only came into being in 1973 when we joined, or 77, it was agreed in 1970, but it became, and even before the UK was a member of the European community, in 1964, we actually negotiated something called the London Convention, which recognised limited historical rights of access to our territorial waters, which we are at that point extending from 6 to 12 miles, following the example of the Icelanders and others. And so we gave historic rights to our continental partners. Limited, but they're there. So this is not an issue of principle, as it will no doubt be presented with a great deal of rhetoric about being an independent, sovereign, coastal state and all this stuff. It is a matter of politics and practicality. And I certainly would warn against ingenious suggestions of swapping concessions by us on fish for, say, financial services. Such ideas are likely to make achieving a balanced outcome on the three elements I have mentioned much more difficult to achieve. And it will make it much more difficult to get a better return for our fishermen than they have now, which I actually think is obtainable, but not a ridiculously better one, not a disproportionately better one. But yes, they will be, I'm sure, could emerge from this negotiation with what would be a better deal for them than they have now, but not if we turn it into an all or nothing approach. Now, I hope that's enough to demonstrate that there are some pretty hard choices to be made by our government in 2020, which will determine whether our new mutual relationship with the EU gets off on a reasonably harmonious, or whether it gets off on a highly acrimonious footing. Now, I say that because I think we can already see the signs of the government saying those beastly people in Brussels are doing us down, we've got to stand up for our rights, Spirit of Dunkirk and a few other matters will be prayed in aid. And that's pretty dangerous stuff, frankly, and there will be some of it. How much of it, I don't know. Now, how about the medium to longer term? Much, of course, will depend on those 2020 negotiations, because if we fail to get an agreement, and if we go out on WTO terms, and if there is a great deal of acrimony, that will, of course, spread right across the board. You can be sure of that. If we do end up without a deal at the beginning of 2021, or if we end up with one which it becomes clear is damaging to our economy, and I personally believe that that is quite likely to be the case, one or other of those, damaging to our security, damaging to our influence in the world, and also damaging, of course, to the rights we have had during our time as members, then it would not be surprising if that circumstance arises, if the opposition parties were to campaign in any subsequent election on a platform of negotiating a better deal, closer deal, if they were to form a government after the next election. But I would have to add to that, that in my view, with the exception of the SNP, in the particular circumstances of their campaign for independence, and of the Republican parties in Northern Ireland, I would not expect any of the main parties in the UK to take up the cause of rejoining the EU, now that remaining is no longer an option. I would not expect that any time soon. Clearly, if I'm correct in that forecast, that creates some difficult problems for those of us who continue to believe that this country has made, I hesitate to say the word a wrong, but disadvantageous choice. I wouldn't dream of trying to tell members of the European movement what to do in those circumstances. That will be one major task for you yourselves to decide. There is one job which doesn't involve any binary choices, and that is to ensure that the EU is seen as it is, and not as its critics and enemies so strongly entrenched within the print and social media would have us believe it is. That will be no easy task, particularly in the near term when we're struggling with this negotiation. But it will be an essential one if the tide is ever to turn at some point in the future. That would involve too, I would suggest, not being uncritically supportive of every twist and turn in EU policy making. Better surely to speak out, to continue to speak out, as we would have done had we still been a member. I myself find no difficulty whatsoever in publicly criticising the French-led decision to refuse to open accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, a refusal which looks as if it may be overcome sometime in the next few months and should never have been placed as it was. I also have no difficulty in arguing, as I did from the very outset, that imposing quotas of third country immigrants by a majority vote was quite simply a bridge too far. And I also think that in the discussions that are going to be engaged in the European Union on its competition powers, in which the admirable Margrethe Vestager is going to have her work cut out to resist cries for make the competition powers more friendly to the creation of, quote, European champions. I hope we will speak up as we would have spoken up when, if we were a member, saying that is not what the competition policy of the European Union was designed to do. And so I think, I would suggest, that our credibility with our friends in the EU will be strengthened and not damaged by our being frank about these things. And I think the same is true for our credibility in this country, where it really is quite important that we don't seem to just be, in a quite different context, me toos to everything that's said in Brussels. Now, I'm afraid that that's about as far as my crystal ball will take me just now. You may yourselves have better ideas, and I'd be delighted to discuss them in the session that follows this, the questions. The one thing I suggest we must not do is to retreat into silence and mourning, just because things have not turned out as we would have wished them to do. Thank you very much.
Very kindly agreed to take questions. I wonder if you would please identify yourself as you ask the question, and please no statements or long preambles. Let's get to the meat straight away, please. And I wonder if I might take Chair's prerogative and ask the first question.
Please.
I'm wondering whether you would like to unpack your statement, your prognosis that Brexit will be damaging to our status in the world. Your experience at the UN makes you uniquely able to shed light on that. We're told that global Britain gives us a wonderful chance to to stride the globe. Britain will once more rule the waves. I wonder, would you like to explain in what ways our status is likely to be diminished?
Yes, well, certainly so. After the great mistakes of the 1950s, which I would categorise as two particular ones, the Suez Adventure and the failure to join the European community at the outset. After that, those mistakes for which we have paid extremely dearly, and after a lot of anxious and difficult negotiations, we joined the European Union. And from that moment on, in 1973, our foreign policy was developed roughly around two relationships. Our relationship with the United States, which remained strong and often, but not invariably, effective, and our relationship in Brussels, where we played an extremely important role in the emerging policies, not just on foreign policy, narrowly defined, but external policy, trade, environment, a lot of other things, a widening number of things. And that relationship, that dual relationship, paid off again and again and again. We had a voice in Washington which was listened to because we had a voice in Brussels which could be effective. And we had a voice in Brussels because we were capable of swaying things in Washington. And just to give you one example of that, a rather unlikely one, because it was very much Margaret Thatcher's doing, but when Ronald Reagan put sanctions on the European Union for daring to have a contract with the Soviet Union for a gas pipeline, which increased, of course, the whole of Europe's dependence on Russian gas, but not to a ridiculous extent. It was Margaret Thatcher who led the charge against that and won. And that was perfectly well noticed in Brussels, because they weren't going to win on their own without us, and we weren't going to win without them. So that relationship, which existed until 2016, but has been waning, of course, ever since the vote and ever since we became completely bogged down in the consequences of the vote, that meant that, in my view, but some would disagree with this, but my experience was certainly bears it out, we did have Boris Johnson's favourite thing, having our cake and eating it. And we had the best of both worlds. And that was a very, very valuable position to be in. That has been junked. It's as simple as that. The Americans will not be interested in us other than as one of quite a large range of countries they would like to get on board. Well, if Donald Trump's the president after he's decided what's going to happen. But they will go to the French if it's anything to do with the use of military force, and they will go to the Germans if it's anything to do with the economy. And will they come to London? No. Why will they not come to London? Because they will calculate that if they strike a deal with Brussels, we'll just do it as well. And we don't need to be paid for it, and we don't need to be allowed to influence it, because our influence might not be helpful to getting the deal between the United States and Brussels, or the United States and the collectivity, above all France and Germany. So I think there are large parts of the world where I'm afraid we have just lost most of the influence we had. The Western Balkans is a very good case. Why have we lost it? Because the only way the Western Balkans have forward is to become members of the European Union. And the British government, outside the European Union, actually agrees with that. But it's a little bit difficult to explain to explain why it is we're leaving an organisation we think it's jolly important for them to join. So they don't pay much attention, and since we don't have any influence over the handling of North Macedonia and Albania in Brussels, why should they pay any attention? They'll be busy fixing things with the French, which I think is probably going to happen. So there are other parts of the world where I think we've lost a lot of influence too, and I don't see how we get it back. Global Britain is one of these slogans which you buy at enormous expense from somebody called a branding advisor. And the branding advisor says, this is absolutely fantastic, and I will show you now a lot of PowerPoint presentation about this wonderful thing, but there's nothing there except the title. And this government, which believes it says in Global Britain, has managed to not have the Foreign Secretary at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, is managing to not have the new Chancellor of the Exchequer at the G20 Finance Minister in Riyadh next week. It's a pretty odd way to be Global Britain, quite apart from the fact that the title in itself is completely spurious, because Britain has been global since somewhere in the 16th century. It was global when we joined the European Union, and we did not cease to be global while we were in the European Union. We actually made the European Union more global than it was before we joined. And we don't therefore get back some globality by leaving. So I'm afraid it's past praying for in presentational terms. In practical terms, of course, we do have to have relationships with all parts of the world because we have worldwide interests, not just in trade, but in security and a whole range of other things. But if we think that that's going to fall into our laps, it's not. It's going to have to be worked for very hard. And as I've said, I don't see much sign that the present government has understood how to set about doing that, certainly not by not going to rather important meetings.
Thank you. Would you like to choose your response,
please.
Dave?
Thank you. My name is Geraldine Coggins, and I wanted to know what you thought about how much of an issue Gibraltar will be in the talks, just as Northern Ireland has been up to now. And of course the Northern Ireland issue hasn't gone away, but people seem to pretend it has.
Well, I think Gibraltar, as those of us who know a little bit about it, and I, alas, know a little bit about it because I was involved in the negotiations which got the Gibraltar-Spain frontier open again after General Franco closed it as the Spanish accession approached. And I actually negotiated with the Spaniards and and highly successful it was too, because it involved going politely and quietly behind the scenes to them and saying, you do understand, don't you, that the House of Commons will not ratify your accession treaty if the border's not open. It'll be no good saying you'll open it after you join, because you won't get accession ratified, so you will be compelled in the most humiliating terms to do it at our request. So over to you. And the Spaniards, being intelligent people, got the message and negotiated the opening of and opened the border and negotiated a deal which has led to the dual entry to Gibraltar Airport and so on. So anyone who was familiar with that story knows that Gibraltar was thrown under a bus by the Brexiters. Strangely enough, all the greatest proponents of standing up for Gibraltar are violent Brexiters, and they will not accept that they have thrown Gibraltar under a bus. What will happen next? I don't know. Normally speaking, the best rule of thumb you can make is that it's a little bit easier to manage left-wing, centre-left Spanish governments than centre-right ones. And that's what we've got now, a centre-left government. And I noticed the new foreign minister made some, I thought, really quite sensible suggestions in an interview to the Financial Times. But it will not be easy, because there is no escaping the fact that that border, which General Franco closed, of course, when Spain became a member of the European Union, having opened it again, it became an internal border of the European Union, over which the Commission, the Court of Justice and others had ultimate say. So the Spaniards could fiddle about a bit on the border, but they couldn't go beyond a certain point. That's ended. It is an external border of the European Union now. And there is no acquis communautaire on how to handle external borders. It is a matter of national sovereignty. So the Spaniards will decide what happens on that border, and we will have to sit down and decide with them. There will be a price to pay. I don't know what the price is. If the Spaniards ask for something excessive about sovereignty, then I think there will be a breakdown. But if they ask for certain greater guarantees about Gibraltar not being used for money laundering, not being used for fraud and all that sort of thing, they've got a good deal already of that, quite rightly so, because we have helped them. And the present Chief Minister of Gibraltar is an extremely savvy man who knows all that I've just said is true. He won't stand up on the platform and say it, but he does understand it, Fabian Picardo. I've talked to him, he knows perfectly well. So we must hope and pray, but because of the way we've handled this, we are actually in the hands of the Spaniards, and it's no good saying we're not. These.
Yeah, I'm Tim Adey. I wanted to ask about the what would happen if there was a deal that was struck by this government, and then later on another government came in and decided that they didn't like it and they wanted, for example, to become much more closely aligned with the EU. Would the EU be willing to negotiate, or is there a chance that they would say, we've had enough of all this negotiation?
Because it'll be in their interest to do so. Because what will be a successor government would be saying was, we think we could have a deeper, better, fuller relationship with the European Union. Of course, that will contain aspects which will be not all that appealing necessarily to some largish part of the electorate here. But then the mess we may have got into by that stage may not be all that appealing either. But if you're asking me, would the European Union be likely to respond positively if a new British government with a majority in Parliament said, we wish to deepen our relationship, we wish to extend it, not we wish to join again. I'm sure they would put us through the ringer of an accession negotiation, but I don't think any successor government in the near future is going to ask for that anyway. We're talking about asking for a deeper, more closer relationship. I think, I don't know, but I can't be sure of this, but I would be pretty startled if they didn't respond positively, particularly since they, by then, will probably be absolutely sick to death of having to deal with a British government that was as difficult as the one they would have been dealing with before it lost its majority. So we'll see. But I think, as I've said in my prepared remarks, that would open up, that if we leave without a deal at the end of this year, or with a very bad one, that will open up some space, which is not campaigning to rejoin, and is not accepting the status quo, the deal that's been negotiated, or the absence of a deal as forever and a day. Yeah, please.
Mark Friedland.
Do you think you could possibly stand up? Because I think
sure
I'll be able to hear better then.
I'm sure we can. One of the matters that greatly concerns me about the immediate prospects for the way the negotiations are going to be framed and conducted is that, if I understand it correctly, they seem at the moment to be entrusted to an individual, David Frost, who, if I understand it correctly, is neither an elected representative nor an accredited diplomat. and it sounds to me as if he reports very directly to the very singularly placed Dominic Cummings. I wonder if you might feel able to comment on the whether you share that concern that this is a very odd way for the negotiation process to be framed, and consider the implications of that, looking back on the history of how earlier negotiations at various stages have been framed and conducted over the past that you know so much about.
Well, I'd like to distinguish between two completely different parts of your question. The first is there anything inherently wrong or improper or anything else you like to say in a pejorative sense about having a senior official from the Prime Minister's Cabinet Office conducting the negotiations? I'd say not. I don't think there's anything improper about that at all. When we joined, Geoffrey Rippon, for most of the time, Tony Barber was just for a month before Ian MacLeod died, ran the negotiations, that didn't really play a huge role in the negotiations. They either were conducted by the Prime Minister, Ted Heath, direct with President Pompidou and others, or they were conducted by Con O'Neill and his team of negotiators, of whom I was an extremely junior one. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that as a modus operandi, no. I'm not sure about the person, but I don't want to express myself in very strong terms because I don't know him very well, and I don't think we've had much experience. But as indeed a procedural way of handling things, no, I don't think there's anything wrong. You've raised also the wider issue of something which I feel extremely strongly about, which is what I call the spadocracy. We are now living in a spadocracy, and that is a terrible thing. That is a complete distortion of everything that the British Constitutional Conventions lays down about being answerable and accountable to Parliament, and elected ministers being ultimately responsible. And it's got worse and worse ever since the floodgates were opened when Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997, and the numbers increased and their influence increased. And now we have a situation where there is a kind of shadow government being run on a weekly basis by Dominic Cummings, who gets all the spads together and tells them what they're going to do in the next week, irrespective of their actual responsibility to the ministers who appointed them. This is pretty desperate stuff, and it's going to have very, very negative, what it already has, but will have more and more negative implications for the conduct of civil service business. It is the negation of everything that the Northcote Trevelyan reforms of the 19th century were set up to avoid: patronage, cronies, etc. So it's bad news. But it's bad news on the British Constitutional Convention line more, I suspect, than it is on negotiating with Brussels. Please.
What do you think about the free ports?
Yes, indeed. Well, it's a wonderful idea, but nobody seems to remember that it was Geoffrey Howe's idea in 1982. He was absolutely obsessed with it. I remember talking to him often about it. He attached huge importance to it. He got his way. Some free ports were set up in the 1980s, and they were completely useless. They didn't do any harm, and they didn't do much good either. And they've gradually withered on the bough. And now some clever person has reinvented them, and no doubt we'll see them set up again, and I see no reason to believe that they will not go the way of the previous lot. The concept doesn't work very well. It involves very complex arrangements of a physical and bureaucratic kind, and the idea that somehow or other some port in Britain is going to turn into the Singapore of the future is not very credible. But in any case, as I say, it's been tried and it didn't work very well. Yes, please.
Andrew Pritchard, you talked about the relationship between ourselves and the United States before and after leaving the European Union. Could you give us some thoughts perhaps about China? One thinks perhaps about Huawei, Hong Kong, and wider issues.
Well, I think I can't tell you a lot about it because I'm not very expert either in the technical aspects of 5G nor in the relationship with China, though I know a little bit about the second but not very much about the first. But just to first thing to point to make is that, like everyone else in the world, we will be sitting on the edge of our seats watching to see who gets elected on the first Tuesday in November in the United States. And the answer to your question will ultimately depend on the answer to that question, over which we have absolutely no influence whatsoever, since, unlike Mr. Putin, we don't even interfere in their elections. So we have absolutely no influence whatsoever. But everyone in the world is sitting waiting for that. President Xi is sitting waiting for it. Kim Jong-un is sitting waiting for it. The Ayatollah Hannay is sitting waiting for it. Everyone is. And nobody's going to take a clear view until they know the answer. 4 more years of Donald Trump or somebody new. And that will be hugely important. Now, I would yield to no one in my criticism of the way that Trump has run US policy. I think it's appalling, apart from the fact that he's an appalling man personally, but his policies are appalling and damaging to the US's network of alliances around the world, and so on. So I would welcome anyone but him for the obvious reason that although, and this is a silly debate that goes on, it will not just be business as usual before 2016 if a Democrat ends up beating Trump. It won't be exactly. The relationship between the United States and China has got a great deal worse on a bipartisan basis in the United States. But it will not be the same as Trump. And the one thing you can be quite certain of is that a Democrat in the White House will have got there saying, I will mend our alliances. That's obvious. It's going to be what they'll say on the campaign trail. And we'll need to respond to that because it's no good thinking that we can then slump back and say, well, we're not going to pay any more into security expenditure in Europe or something like that. Then we'll just end up in a mess again. So we'd have to respond to that. But I think both we outside the European Union and the European Union will realise that it's our interest to respond to that and to show a new American president that the previous one had got it wrong and that we are prepared to pull our weight a bit more. So that is the crucial issue. Now, if we have to have 4 more years of Trump, it's going to be desperately, desperately uncomfortable. But we'll have to live with it. And it will not mean that we do not have still a crucial relationship with the United States, not with its president. A special relationship is not a special relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. It's between Britain and the United States. And we'll still have that. And from subject area to subject area, it'll be very different. On climate change, for example, frankly, I am quite sanguine about the absence of Trump from that. I don't think it makes a damn bit of difference. The fact of the matter is that large swathes of the United States are already implementing the Paris agreements, California, New York, and so on, and that's going to continue, perhaps strengthen, whatever Trump says. Are they digging more coal out of the ground? No, because nobody wants to buy it. So I don't actually think it will matter that much. I think the best we can hope for this year in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow is to somehow persuade Trump to just shut up. Not a thing he does very easily, but to keep out of it, because they have no role to play. They're withdrawing the day after the presidential election, if he's elected, and if not, they won't withdraw. And the fact of the matter is that if we are successful at Glasgow, and that's a pretty long shot, particularly the way the government is handling it, but if we are successful, the United States will benefit just like everyone else. So that's climate change. Trade, I'm quite sure that outside the European Union we will wish to negotiate an agreement with the United States. I think the basis on which we've set about doing it with this president is likely to produce an extremely bad deal. I think a better deal might be on offer from another president, but we'll try and get a deal. And I have no desire to eat chlorinated chicken. I frankly don't have no desire to eat any chicken that graces a supermarket shelves. But I don't think it's the end of civilization as we knew it. So I think a little bit of calm is needed on that. I do think that interfering with the National Health Service would be very, very serious, and I'm sure no government will go within miles of that. But I just think a bit less. I mean, there's been an enormous amount of hyperbole about what a deal could offer, which is far beyond what it's actually capable of delivering, and it certainly can't compensate for a bad trade relationship with the European Union. Moreover, there isn't going to be a UK-US deal until the United States know what our access to the European Union is going to look like, because that's going to be absolutely crucial for their investors and their traders. So that, security issues, it's rather hard to say. Trump has caused quite a lot of damage in NATO, but the members of NATO, including the United States, know just how crucial it is, and I have a feeling it will probably survive even 4 more years of Trump, and helped no doubt by our determination to put whatever we can into the basket of enabling it to survive. So I think it will be a pretty grim situation if we have 4 more years of Trump, but it's one we will have to manage. It's one we will have to come to terms with the realities, like we are coming to terms with the realities of Brexit. Yeah, please.
Thank you for reminding us, and super talk, who've reminded us what Brexit is like. It's a gift that keeps on giving. And one aspect I think that particularly has come to light is the problems of Ireland. Like Geraldine, I'm Irish. And I'm wondering, well, 2 things. One, when the Prime Minister signed the withdrawal agreement, did he read it and understand what it said about Northern Ireland? Because he and his current Northern Ireland Secretary seem to believe something quite different than it says. And secondly, do you see Northern Ireland being the undoing of the relationship, for example, with the United States, given that Congress has said what it has about the Northern Ireland Agreement? And finally, crystal ball, how do you see things in 10 years' time?
Yes, well, I don't know whether he understood what he was doing or not. I mean, the basic deal was struck walking around a garden somewhere in Cheshire with Leo Varadkar. And I really don't know whether he understood what he was doing. And subsequently, I don't know, since he's given on numerous occasions an inaccurate account of what the agreement implies, and there will be controls in the Irish Sea. I don't know the answer to that, whether he knew what he was doing or whether he didn't. My hunch is that he had a shrewd suspicion what he was doing and he didn't care a damn. But I don't think that probably is all that relevant now, because it's in treaty form, ratified, and now it will have to be implemented. And that is partly in the hands of the Commission, and you can be quite sure they will not skimp on the controls that they insist on. Sorry, the second part of your question was about...
well, US trade.
Sorry?
US trade being...
Oh yes, I think that's gone away, really. That related to the period when Theresa May was saying that any controls in the Irish Sea was something no Prime Minister could contemplate, and we might have had a situation then in which a deal was struck which was very disadvantageous to the Republicans in the north and very advantageous to the DUP. That's gone because the DUP were thrown under a bus, which you may well think they deserve to be, but that's another matter. But they were thrown under a bus. And so the deal that we have struck contains no particular problems for the Americans. They're all for us, not for the Americans. So I don't think we should think that Congress may well dislike a deal because the House of Representatives has a Democrat majority and they hate Trump, and they won't like a Trump deal, but I don't think there'll be a Trump deal unless he's re-elected. And then, because I don't think it'll be before November. It could be, but I don't think so. And then the final part of your question was about the effect on the Irish situation. Well, my own hunch is that Northern Ireland is now on a slipway leading towards the reunification of the island. I don't think it'll happen very quickly for a whole number of reasons, one of which is that no Irish politician actually wants it to happen quickly because they don't quite know where to get all that money that we continually send across the Irish Sea to Northern Ireland, and because it has innumerable constitutional complications about the role to be given to the Protestant community and so on. So I think they'd rather, like St. Augustine or whoever it was, it happened, but not tomorrow, please. But equally, I think that all the forces that I can see are pushing in that direction. There's not just the demography, which is of course fairly important, as the Catholics and Unionists and Republicans, as it were, and the moderate pro-European Unionists become more numerous, and the Protestants, the ultra-Protestants, become less so, which doesn't mean to say the process will be entirely smooth. But I think that is moving that way, and I think that the arrangements that have been made will basically bring home to the people of Northern Ireland, including the Protestants, that they're a lot better off effectively in the European Union than they would be outside it. And so one day the point's going to come home that it'd be quite nice to have a voice in Brussels about all these things that they're having to do, rather than just be told that's what you have to do because it's been decided in Brussels and you've had no influence on it. So I don't quite see that being reversed. I think it will happen, but quite slowly. And I think it's important not to either imply that we think that's a jolly good thing, though I think quite a lot of British people will, in their heart of hearts, because I think that will lay us open to charges of lacking patriotism, and I don't think that's a wise place to be. But it's not in our control, so we don't need to worry. It doesn't matter a damn what we think about it. If I'm right in my analysis, it's happening anyway, and it doesn't matter what we say. I think myself that that could well happen more smoothly and more quickly than anything on the Scottish front, because I'm not at all convinced. I think the Scots might be heading for quite a bad election result for the SNP in 2021, the next Holyrood election, although the Conservatives have just elected a leader who doesn't look terribly appealing. But I think it could well go, and they've got the trial of Alex Salmond, they've got other scandals bubbling away there, and they've got the fact that leaving the UK single market in order to get back into the European one will not be a trouble-free experience, although it might, over time, a very long amount of time, be positive for Scotland. So I rather think that that may be on a slower track than a lot of people think it is. But it will be kept on the track by the fact that there will be endless friction about handling devolved matters like fisheries. For a number of years now, it has been possible to manage fisheries quite amicably between the Scots, the Welsh, the Northern Irish and the English. Because why? Because all the decisions were taken in Brussels. And all that was left was implementation. And the implementation, which was deciding which ships were allowed to catch which stocks and all that sort of thing, was, well, it was manageable. It was manageable. And the Scots were given a big say in the British negotiating position in Brussels. Now, those powers are coming back to Westminster. And that will not be the same at all. So there will be enormous friction over fisheries between Westminster, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. And that will be a continuing feature of the way ahead, partly because fisheries is a devolved matter, though not the negotiation about fisheries with third countries.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
I was on the phone to the Home Office today, and I asked if they had a legal advisor as well as a team member who could kind of tell me how to log on the system. I've already bought the manual, it's £10, and I can get a lawyer for an hour for £250, or I can pay £1,000. I've done a lot of legal business. I've stopped fracking in the UK and in Denmark. So I've done a lot of legal things, and I can't make head and tail on it. So it sounds like the coming years there's going to be a lot of collateral that can be corrected. I got married a year ago. How are we going to correct our lives? What's going to happen to us?
Well, I think the withdrawal agreement, which is an international treaty which Britain and the European Union have signed, contains a huge amount of relatively helpful material which will be applied, and for the next 8 years there will be recourse ultimately to the European Court of Justice on disagreements. And moreover, I think the British government of the day will be under some pressure to honour that, particularly since they are busy setting up a very restrictive immigration regime, which will make it all the more necessary that the 3 million European Union and EEA citizens who are already here don't start flocking back to their own countries. So I wouldn't wish to give you, I mean, off the top of my head, and as a non-lawyer and not, thank God, having anything to do with the Home Office, I wouldn't wish to give you, to make it sound too easy. But they have signed up, I think they are in the process of signing up 3.2 million people to settled status. Settled status is going to be not as good as being as when we were in, but quite close, not that far off. There will be rough edges, hard decisions to be made about individuals. I'm sorry, I don't want to say more than that because it just seems to me quite wrong. But what I would say is it's worth sticking with the process.
There's only been 6 refusals so far.
Sorry? There have only been 6 refusals so far, yes. I think, I think it's worth sticking with the process because I think, for the reasons I've given about the restrictive nature of the immigration white paper that came out yesterday, that they are actually going to be fairly desperate to ensure that the 3.2 million don't up sticks and leave. So I think that some effort will be made, however much they may go against their instincts, some effort will be made to ensure that doesn't happen, and that will of course cover cases like yours.
Can I just ask if everyone heard about the 101-year-old Italian who'd been here for many years, who applied for settled status, and the computer insisted on wanting to know the address for his parents, because no one had thought to tell the computer that someone might apply with an age in 3 digits. So the computer believed he was 1 and wanted to know the address of his parents. With some assistance, I believe he eventually got it sorted.
Yes, I'm absolutely sure there will be horror stories of that kind will pop up all the time. I'm afraid they will have to be handled through due process. There is every evidence that our courts will handle them in a proper way, and I just don't think we should. I think we just chalk that all up to the silly things that have happened because the electorate got the decision wrong in 2016 and 2019. But of course, these cases will come up, particularly because the Home Office is a bit like that. Yes, please.
Slightly odd question. I think a short answer. My name's Patrick Davey, by the way. I anticipate a short answer. And regards to my own views, not betrayed by the question. The question is, will any good come out of Brexit?
Yes. Well, my children would tell you that I never give anyone a short answer. But leaving that on one side, I can't see it happening. There's a rather well-documented story about 1945 election when Churchill said to his wife Clementine, "We must look at the bright side. We must look for a silver lining," and she said, "Remarkably well concealed in this case." I think that goes for Brexit too. Sorry. Yes, please.
My concern is the infrastructure development and the monies that come from the European Union. My name is David Williams. The European Union about 30 years ago established a principle of Europe of the regions and trying to give money to the poorer areas of Europe. If we go into Brexit, my worry is that the pressure will be to implement a market policy. Now, I'm wondering where the British government are going to go on this, because they've made a commitment they would spend the same amount of money on infrastructure, but where will it actually go? And it's a confusing thing because, one, we've got HS2, which you could argue is helping the north in some way, or other areas of Britain. But when you look at other things, such as, say, the rate support grant, clearly the regions, the poorer areas, are starting to lose out. Again, that's going to be a fundamental difference between Europe trying to help poorer regions and yet Britain still having this philosophy of free markets and let things flow. I think that's a real big problem, especially for local government who are trying to plan and use that money.
Well, I would be rather inclined to not go along fully with your analysis. For the following reason. First of all, in the latter years of our membership, European assistance to regions has become pretty restricted. And there aren't many regions in the UK that were still getting the full whack. Cornwall, bits of Wales, and bits of Scotland, and that was about it. So I don't actually think that there will be a huge loss there, partly also because we now have a government that seems to have decided that it's going to pour quite a lot of money into parts of the country that are, some of which were covered by those European monies. We were always massive net contributors to the Europeans, to the European regional, and even more so once the East and Central Europeans had come in. So I don't think we'll get anywhere saying that we need a European regional policy back in order to deal with our regions, because I think it'll be very easy to knock that down as an argument. Now, what you say about market economies and so on, I wonder really whether we are in the end going to be much more market oriented than the rest of Europe is. After all, the treaties, as augmented by the Single European Act, which set up the single market, is a pretty strong market-oriented system. It's one which we should feel, I feel, having negotiated it, quite proud of. It has, in fact, brought massive prosperity to people in this country and people all across Europe. There are no doubt changes to it which will need to be made along the way. There are improvements to it. Is it about to lurch in one direction or towards a much more market-oriented system, or to one much more state-centred? No. because there are a wide spectrum of different views across the European Union, and I don't think the necessary majorities or unanimity will be achieved to shift it very much one way or the other. Moreover, I don't frankly see this government. After all, the Prime Minister actually said in the campaign that he wanted to be able to hand out state aids. An astonishing thing for a Conservative Prime Minister to say, particularly given the experience that Ted Heath had over Rolls-Royce and so on. I don't think it'll actually happen. But that's not in the direction of a market-oriented approach, it's away from it. So I don't think there's much there either. I'm sorry to be a little bit discouraging to your 2 points of your question, but I don't think either of them are really central to our future relationship. Yes?
You gave me a little bit of cheer at one stage when you appeared to contemplate the possibility of an alternative government sometime in the future. And given that there are a very large number of people who think that a big mistake has been made, in the scenarios that you have run over this evening, which do you think are the things which, when they emerge, will allow a larger number of people to realise that the mistake has been made? Which things are likely to trigger that sort of reflection and response that might lead eventually to a change of government?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it depends what you mean by a mistake being made. I think for those of us in this room, we know perfectly well what we mean. We mean leaving the European Union. But the majority of our countrymen do not regard that as a mistake. They may come to regard it as a mistake, but they do not currently regard it as a mistake. So I think it would be very unwise, and I have explained why, if we camped, as it were, on what I call the big mistake, because I think that will cut us off from the main political parties in opposition, as well as the party in government, who will not contemplate ever going to that place. I don't believe the Labour Party will. I don't even believe the Lib Dems will, which is why I say that I don't think that nailing anybody's colours to the rejoin mast is going to be at all helpful. The other aspect to your question is, what if we don't get a deal at all and leave without a deal on what is charmingly known as Australian terms at the end of the year, or if we leave with a very bad deal which subsequently proves to be a very bad deal? Well, I do think that that will open up space in whenever the next election is going to come along. And don't forget that the Fixed Term Parliament Act is going to be repealed. So more likely than not, it will come along roughly in 2023, 4 years after 2019, which was the usual periodicity until the Fixed Term Parliament Act came in. I think it will open up space then for opposition party and parties to say, we're not going to try and, we're not asking you to vote to rejoin, we're just asking you to vote to get a better deal. And so I think that will, and if I had to graduate those, I think the easiest space to occupy will be if there's no deal at all. A less easy space will be if there's a obviously bad deal that's not working out, and the least space is if there's a deal which people more or less feel they can live with. So that's the best answer I can give you now, after all 4 years away from when that is likely to become a potential reality. But even that opportunity that will exist if we left without a deal, don't underestimate how difficult it will be, because what the parties saying we'll get you a better deal with Brussels will be saying is, we think the government was wrong to reject the level playing field, we will accept the level playing field, we'll accept Brussels' decisions on state aids, on competition issues, on regulation and so on. That won't be an easy sell. It will not be easily accepted. It will be very easy to demonise it, as it will be, by the government of the day, Conservative government of the day, who will say they just want to put us back under Brussels' yoke without having any say in the decisions. So it will be quite difficult. On the other hand, it could be quite compelling if it is obvious that the government has made a hash of it. And after all, governments usually fall through the mistakes they make, not through the brilliance of the opposition. Yes, sorry, there was somebody...
I think this must be the last question.
Oh, right. Yes, please.
Pamela Dunbar, I agree with a lot of what you said about medium-term tactics, but correct me if I'm wrong. I've done as much research as I can into opinion polls, and it seems to me overwhelmingly likely that we actually left with Remain majority, a pro-European majority.
Yes.
And secondly, given that this is the case, and given that demography is on our side, is not one thing we could do simply to ensure that as much as possible exchange takes place between the guys on the continent and us, so that the upcoming Britons can fall in love with Europe as we did in our day?
Yes, well, I absolutely agree with your conclusion, 100%. And it will be a difficult task because the rest of this year, they will be demonised. I mean, the rest of Europe will be demonised, and it will not be easy. And you are quite right. And keeping open programmes like Erasmus and so on, it will be hugely important. And you're right about the demography being on our side. Where I would not counsel going is an analysis of where the votes would have gone in 2019 if we'd had a referendum, or where they did go in the election. Frankly, it will get nowhere, that. Partly because the results can be construed in any number of different ways, and there are quite enough clever people who construe them in a different way, but partly because it's frankly irrelevant. The election has taken place. The government is the government, properly constituted. You may think it's an awful government, but it's properly constituted under our conventional practice. So I don't think that going back there will help very much. I think if you have to go back, it's better to go back to the fact that the Leavers told a lot of lies in 2016, which have now been proved to be completely wrong. That will not be open to countering. But I think saying that the outcome of the 29 election would have been different is very, very tricky territory. Among other things, just take this for example. In order to have a British government that wants a better relationship with Europe than this government will have got by then, or none at all if it's got nothing, you basically mean it's got a government which is either a Labour majority government or a Labour-led coalition. The Labour Party is not going to thank you for saying that first past the post brought about the 2019 result, because they will want it to bring about the 2023 result. And so I would urge you all to be very, very careful about this, because this is not a question of your own personal views in party political terms, Labour, Lib Dem, whatever it is. Everyone in this country has those views, are entitled to those views, should go out and express those views. But on the European issue, just remember that we've got to find a majority in the House of Commons to do what we want. We can't do without that. It's no good winning the argument and then finding that not one single one of the main parties, or possibly one, the Lib Dems, but I don't think they'll go very close to it after the appalling mistakes that were made on their behalf in 2019. So be careful about it. I spent a lot of last year trying to stop very enthusiastic members of the People's Vote campaign from slugging it, from being rude to the Labour Party, which amply deserved one to be rude to them. And what the hell good was it going to do? Because if they weren't prepared to vote for a referendum, we weren't going to get one. So you just do have to always remember that. And I think the European movement, I hope the European movement, will keep its doors open to all the main political parties, including the Conservative Party, and will try to work with like-minded people in them and not to take positions which are fundamentally inimical to their party positions.
I think that's a splendid note on which to draw this fascinating discussion to an end. And I'd like to invite the past principal of this college, Alice Prochaska, to propose a vote of thanks.
Well, I won't take up very much time doing that because we've had the most wonderful and enthralling hour and a half, and thank you very, very much for it. Lord Hannay, you and I have one thing in common, and maybe much more. We were both taught by Agatha Ram.
Right.
And I can't swear to this, but I think that Agatha Ram might possibly chide either of us for feeling that global Britain goes back to the 16th century. In my historical canon, it goes back at least to the Anglo-Saxon world, which was a world of very international learning, and maybe that's a cheering thought, which you encouraged by referring to the long period when we have been global Britain. You have told us so many wonderful and useful things. You have urged us to be practical. You have urged us to be patient. I don't think you necessarily used that word, but it's what we all need to draw from so much that you said. You also urged us, and I quote from your words, do not retreat into silence and mourning. And I think we should all thank you very much for that, and for the various different ways that you have pointed to where we should not be retreating, where we still can hope to combat the wave of xenophobia that Brexit has enabled, and all the other dreadful things that we see happening. There is much to be done, and you've given us lots and lots of pointers, and I think we should all be very much in your debt. So thank you.